So hi, my name is Madison Scott Clary. You might know me as Maddie or as Makio. I am an author and editor and nerd living up in the Pacific Northwest. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm going to talk to you today about layout and design and how to reduce the barriers between your story and your readers. So just to kind of get started, what we're going to be talking about today are just some foundations to get you going. We're just going to kind of give you the language to work with layout and design, partly because, I don't want to go into too much specifics, but also because it's like really late. So this is also going to be a tool agnostic presentation. I'm not going to go into Microsoft Word or InDesign or anything like that. I'm not going to go into actual tools that people are using. But what I really want to do is to get you thinking about why this is important. I might be able to do this here real quick. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why this is actually important. So it's great that you wrote your story, right? And it's also nice that you seem to have an audience, people who like to read your story. But there's you need to do a little bit more work beyond the end of writing and editing your story. In most cases, you'll want your audience to get to your story as easily as possible, and that means reducing the barriers between them and your story. And that's because reading is work. It takes effort to get the words from the page into the reader's mind. And so what you want to do is reduce the amount of friction between your story and the reader. So the less attention the reader is paying to the act of reading, the more they are paying to your story as a whole. So, for example, let's talk about the oft-maligned widows and orphans. Widows are the last lines of paragraphs at the top of a page, right? Because they've been widowed from the rest of the paragraph. Orphans are the first lines of paragraphs alone at the bottom of a page. That's because they've been, born into the world without the rest of their paragraph, without the rest of their family. And there is a good reason for this. When your eyes zoom from the bottom of one page to the top of the next, or when turning pages, it takes effort to kind of hold, it might be minuscule, but it does take effort to hold the current topic in mind. That's sort of amplified when you turn pages as well. So this is an example of a bad widow and a bad orphan. The bad widow is a single word at the top of the second page. It's really jarring for the next line, right? So that quiet hum in the background building, gotta get to the top exponentially, right? The bad orphan is right before the page break, leaving the reader in suspense as to the rush of in the rush to kind of turn the page. So you kind of have to spend that extra bit of effort to get to the started to pick up turning the page sound from the speakers. While this isn't technically a widow or orphan, I did want to call to attention the bit here where at the top of the fourth page there, the slides aren't progressing. Oh no. Okay. Wow. I've been giving a whole talk here. I also have a cat. Okay. I apologize for that. I had slides going every which way. Okay, so I will do my notes from memory. Okay, so here we have an example of the first example that I mentioned was the bad widow being a single word, and then the bad orphan coming right before a page break. One other thing that I wanted to call to attention is that this isn't necessarily a widow, but if it had been, it would be a particularly bad one as a subjunctive clause. Because when your eyes make that jump to the top of the page, you will see, you'll catch sight of this punctuation mark. And as you're gliding through the text, you may not quite register that it's a comma and be surprised by, rather than the stage, which is not a full sentence. So sometimes widows and orphans are unavoidable. So in this case here, this is obviously contrived, but in this case here, you might find that this widow was completely unavoidable. You couldn't do it without feathering the text, or you didn't want to, it was just too awkward to get away with. In this case, it might have been allowable because it's not at a page break, and it's not an entire subjunctive clause. If XLR had been up there, you might have run into a little bit more trouble. Additionally, this might be an okay example of an orphan, in that this orphan at the bottom of the page is, it's not a clause on its own. It would be able to, the reader would be able to get to the rest of the text just fine. So sometimes when they're not, when it just doesn't work out to your advantage, you can compromise a little bit. This one, just no. Honestly, you don't want to have a single word on a page. And if you're having your, okay, I'm glad that you can see them. I am getting some messages from chat here. Okay, so if you have a single word on a page, that's probably just not gonna cut it for y'all. Okay, so I am going to quit Telegram real quick because I'm getting all the notifications. Okay, so if you need one rule, if I can give you one rule, it is that you need to give your text room to breathe. That is the number one thing that is going to allow a reader to be able to make their way through your book with as little impact as possible. So this takes the form of spacing, and there are 3 different kinds of spacing that I'm going to talk about right now. The first is margins, which is the space around the block of text on the page. The second is leading, which is the space between lines of text. And the third is kerning, which is the space between characters in a line. So margins are particularly important because they control where you hold the page when you are holding a book. So in particular, you want to keep an eye out on the top, bottom, and outer to be at least ½ inch, because that gives individuals, your readers, a place to put their thumbs when they're holding on the sides of the page, or their thumb and pinky if they're holding the book in one hand. And just we have to kind of keep in mind that that also includes the headers and footers. The headers should not be covered up, or the page numbers should not be covered up by your fingers, and the headers, you don't want to have them crowded up against the very top of the page. For the inner margin, which is where the 2 pages meet near the binding, that should be at least 3/4 of an inch, but that also does depend on the page count. So if you have a longer book, you might find yourself needing more than 3/4 of an inch, maybe up to 1 inch, in order to not have the text all crowded in the valley. So let's take a look at an example here. This is an example where I've added the frames, the layout frames. So you can see that there is, a ½ inch on each side of the page, 3/4 of an inch because it was a relatively short book, and that the footer has been included in the within the margins. If we take a look at a fuller example here, this is from a longer book, so you can see that the inner margin is actually 7/8 of an inch in this case, and you can see that the headers have been included within the margins so that they're not cramped up against the top of the book. Leading is actually, the term comes from when they would typeset using actual movable type, and putting in the letters one by one in that long block. And in order to space the text out, they would insert these thin shims of lead in with the type so that it would keep the lines separated by that much. The industry standard kind of runs between 1.2 and 1.5. What that means is if you have 10-point text, you give the line of text what would be equivalent to 12 points. That gives you, 2 points, which is, there are 72 points an inch or whatever, of space before starting the next line. And that keeps the text spread out enough that it doesn't feel cramped vertically. I personally, often, at least online, you will see leading of 1.2. You'll see this in a lot of books as well, where the line height is about a factor of, 10 to 12. And there will be a good bit of, there'll be enough space that it can kind of, that it looks great. I personally like leading of about 1.5 because I feel like it makes for a brisker read. It makes it feel like you're kind of coasting through the text rather than, crawling down the page. One thing you might want to keep in mind here is what your genre is. Something like an adventure book or an action book, a book with more action you may find that a wider leading might actually help out by making it feel speedier, whereas something like, like an academic text or something more stately, you may find 1.2 helps out more there. So for kerning is the space between letters. And if I have one bit of advice to you, if you're thinking about dealing with kerning, don't. Just, I'm sorry to say, but all of the typesetting programs, whether it's Microsoft Word all the way up to, InDesign or Affinity or LaTeX, they all do a much better job of kerning than you will do by hand within the body text of a book. You may have, to deal with some of that on the title page, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And obviously, if you are designing the cover of your book, you may have to deal with it there as well. But in the internals of the book, just don't worry about it. All fonts that you deal with and all the software used for typesetting are going to be... Is it time to scratch the scratch pad? Okay, so scratch the scratch pad. That's going to be taken care of for you. So one way to think about it that might be a bit more useful is to consider it like rhythm. You have your horizontal rhythm, which is how fast and how steadily one should move throughout the book. That's taking into account where do you start your chapters? Do you start your chapters only on the right-hand page, the recto page? Do you, do you have a half title page, or should it be just the title page, copyright, and boom, text? You're right into the book. There's all sorts of different things you can consider in terms of horizontal rhythm. And then you have your vertical rhythm, which is how should pages be laid out from top to bottom? What is the space between the header and the body of text? Do you have them closer together but put in a margin, or sorry, a border? Or, do you have them further apart and no border? What is your leading, and so on? So let's move on to font choice. Here I'm going to be using the word font to refer to a typeface or a font family, which would be something like Times New Roman, or Merriweather Sans, which is what this font is right here. For the body text, this will always, always, always be a serif font. And the reason for this is pretty simple, which is that serifs guide the eye along the text. And serifs, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but just in case you can't, I will describe. Serifs are the little lines along the bottoms and the tops of letters. Sometimes you'll see them on, this one doesn't have great examples on S's, but sometimes you'll see them pretty sharply on S's. And what that does is it provides a subtle hint of a horizontal line that your eye can travel along. And it helps keep your eye within the current row of text. Whereas a sans serif font, like the title here, is good for titles because it kind of stops and it kind of forces you to engage with that text a bit more heavily. I just, you just lost the stream. Is it back? Okay. I think if I click on this window, I will lose the stream, which is disheartening, but I will keep that in mind. So this is not necessarily the place to get adventurous. You'll probably want to stick with a very small subset of serif fonts. You're going to, stick with your Times New Romans and your Garamons and your Gentiums. This here is a Gentium font. It is a Gentium Book Basic, which is one of my favorite fonts, and I will always root for it. But you can kind of play around with your tastes and your text. So if you have something that is, literary fiction or a bit more serious, you might consider Garamond, which has kind of a stately feel to it. If you got something that's a bit more action oriented, you might go for a Times family. And if you've got something that's like a bit more, thoughtful and maybe romantic, you might go for something like Gentium, which is a bit of a softer looking font. And then usually 11 points is a good font size most of the time for books. You can go down to 10. Going up to 12 is going to start making it feel like a children's book. So for headers and footers, it can be the same as the body, but it can be the same as the body. Obviously, you might want to put in a bit of thought into differentiating your headers and your footers from the body text, though. If you're going to keep the font the same, you might consider having a border beneath the header before the body text. But what you can do is throw in a little bit of variation. So Gentium, this Gentium Basic font comes in two variations. It comes in Gentium Book Basic, which is kind of a heavier weight of the font, and Gentium Basic, which is slightly lighter, technically meant for reading better on screens, but by virtue of it being lighter, it draws less attention. So if you're going to have that as your header font, that will help, keep the eye focused on the body text. So the goal here is basically just you don't want to be distracting your readers from the content. Titles, and here by titles, I mean like the title of the book. So if you've got your half title page, which is the very first page of the book that has just the title of the book, if you have that, your title page with the title and author. If your book has multiple parts, that is those are usually on their own page. And if you have chapters within your book with chapter titles or chapter numbers, you might consider having a bit more inventive of a font, right? So, again, take into account what your text is saying. So you can fit your genre. Like if you've got this blasters and ray guns and space battles, like just go all out. Just own it. Go for something like Orbitron. If you got something that's like a rom-com or something that's, maybe just really cheesy and you just love cheese, and that's great, go for Luckiest Guy. Maybe you have fantasy or historical fiction. Something along the Antiqua line of fonts is going to serve you quite well. And I really like Inknot Antiqua for that. I've used that in a couple of different books. So I mentioned this earlier. If you need to kern, this is probably when it will happen. A good example of this is when I was doing the title page for Arcana. That did need a little bit of kerning work because some fonts don't play well with all caps. So I used a font called I don't remember what it was called. but it had a very curly N for Arcana, and the A's next to it in all caps just looked awful. So I had to kind of hand kern that a little bit. But in general, please just don't worry about kerning. Your typesetting program will take care of that for you. In in the chat, somebody suggested fonts for cultures and places. There's definitely, some considerations to be there, as long as you're sensitive about it. A brushstroke font for something set in an Asian culture could be seen as kind of insensitive. To make sure that you're treating not only your text but the culture with respect. And also, like, I didn't mention this earlier, but in the body text, there are probably instances or there can be instances when you have more than one font family. Um, uh, I have a book, Ally, that uses two different font families for two different characters, but since there are it's not structured as dialogue, that is the signifier, that is the tag. And if you have somebody typing at a computer console, font for that. Your biggest friend here is going to be Google Fonts. Fonts.google.com is your friend. You can go search a cajillion fonts. There are so many fonts, and it'll let you download them and everything. The thing is, you just kind of want to check the licenses. There is an open font license. Some of them are licensed for free to use on the web, but not for print. So that's just kind of the thing that it's kind of something that you'll want to keep an eye on. They're really easy to read. They're usually only a pair in terms of the license that tells you what you can use the font for. So, in conclusion, my number one rule is to let your text breathe. You need to give it the room so that your readers can, move their way through their text, obviously, by reducing the barriers between the active reading and the, taking in of your lovely story. So you want to make your story as easy to read as possible. And now that you know all these rules, you can break them. So that is all I have for right now. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. I will probably stop streaming this particular screen, but I will turn on my camera, I think. And I can open it up for Q&A and then look at the Twitch chat to do that. So stop streaming, turn on camera. Hi, Madison. So I will open up Twitch and I can start taking some questions. For Writers Guild. Twitch will take forever to load. Okay, cool. I did not get some of the chat here, so I'm looking at my phone. Okay, so someone, Janora Foyer says, don't go overboard. Multiple fonts is one of those cases of just because you can doesn't mean you should. This is true. Like I mentioned having two fonts. I think that two is a good, comfortable maximum for laying out text in a book, right? Like if you have to have a distinctive font for certain cases, like typing on a terminal, that's two fonts. You've got your base font and that font. So that's a good max. If you need to bump it up to 3, reconsider your options. Okay. Old Pine says, what sorts of layout differences might one need to consider when arranging for both print and ebook? That is a good question. Ebooks are treated in a fundamentally different way than physical books because there is not necessarily a concept of a page. You may page through your book on your Kindle, but not everybody's Kindle is the same size. Not everybody uses the same size fonts. So you can you can continue to try and fiddle with a little bit of the you can fiddle with the leading, you can fiddle with the fonts that you were using, but you're not going to have to worry. You're not going to be able to worry too much about your, um, worry too much about the vertical rhythm of your book, because it's just not it. It's closer to thinking of it as a web page that you scroll through one screen at a time than it is as a book. Again, don't let that stop you from being inventive. You can embed fonts in all of the popular ebook formats. All your ebook readers will be able to override that if they want. It's really great that Kindles, one of the most popular ebook readers out there, provide open dyslexia. I think that is a great feature for ebooks. Okay. Shimamas, I apologize if I am butchering your name. I was wondering about using fonts that aren't on the nose for cultures and places. For example, there are some fonts that, though clearly of Western use, really come off as another culture. And mentioned Songti for China, Arial for Israel, and a few for India. There are a few considerations that you can make. But what you don't want to, what the sort of golden rule here is that you don't want to essentially commodify an entire region for down into a single a single font choice. You can hint at it, and obviously, there are conscientious ways to do it. But in general, I think that leaning on aesthetics of a font rather than the actual design of it are going to treat you a little bit better. Times New Roman is much lighter. Garamond is much lighter, a much statelier font. So if you're writing something in sort of a Chinese court setting, then maybe that's a good choice for you. Whereas if you're writing something in a historic setting in Europe, you might look at Inknut Antiqua is obviously a display font, but you might look at another Antiqua family for use in the body text and for your headers. So you're looking more to hint than to sort of like bash over the head of your reader what a font should evoke. So I mentioned earlier, I might be able to do this. Let me see here. I'm going to share my entire screen. I can't share my entire screen. I can share my entire screen. Okay. Okay, so I'm now sharing my entire screen. Resolute if there is anything that needs to be done there. I can show a little bit more of some of the stuff that I was talking about. So if we go to a lot of the examples in the text were brought from the book Koheleth, which I'll have a reading of tomorrow, and we can take a look at some of the text in practice. So it's probably loud me typing on that keyboard. Okay, let me keep an eye on chat here and see if I can if folks can see my screen. Okay, cool. Yeah, so here you can see that we have, the text is 1.5 leading, but the subtle difference in setting aside the headers from the body font using a similar idea of font. It's a similar font weight, but this one's a sans serif font as opposed to the body font. This plays out even in the chapter titles, and so similar font weight. The size scales nicely with the font, and that carries over even into the title page. So I can bring up also Arcana. The example that I mentioned from Arcana was, you can see some bad leading here. I wish that I had fixed that, but I was running short on time. But this is what I meant about the N here being kind of curly. That needed a little bit of finessing with the kerning in order to get that N not cramped up against this A, and this A not feeling like it was being left off at the very end there. Okay, if handwriting is being shown, how do you recommend? I think the easiest way and the lowest friction way is to simply use italics. Italics are usually used for emphasis, but if you have a long block of it, people will generally understand that it is you're showing a written note. The reason I suggest italics as the low friction way is that italics come from the same font family, so that it's not going to be nearly as jarring going from one font to another. Let me go back. Let me go back here. I have a character in this who speaks in italics, and this will help illuminate my point a little bit better. So you can see that this is still the same font. That the information or the visual information being conveyed by the font is obviously the same. This I is the italic version of this I. Like, that's just something the reader will kind of pick up on, and I think that that is the simplest way. If you do want to pick out a handwriting font, I would go for one that is. I'm going to get in a little bit of trouble for this, but I would suggest going for one that is closer to Comic Sans than it is to Papyrus. And the reason is that Comic Sans is a very rounded version of a pretty basic sans serif font. So what you are looking for is essentially a sans serif font. Obviously, pick a more expressive one than Comic Sans. Comic Sans is great. I feel like Comic Sans is unfairly maligned, but pick a more expressive one than Comic Sans for handwriting. But what you don't want is something that is way too flowery. Let me see if I can open a font book. Fonts, please come here. Okay, so I have one home. So like this one's okay, but it's too cursive. So it kind of depends on sort of how flowery you get. This one's too cursive. I've got a couple of others that are better examples. I don't know how interesting it is for me to scroll through my font book, but I can give it a quick cursory look. There it is. Give you glory. See, something like this is going to serve you much better than something like Papyrus because it's very blunt, right? It's very easy for you to kind of just scroll through. To read through. It still feels like handwriting, but it's not too out there. Francis Polly asks, how do you deal with rivers inside the text? I find that rivers are often. I find less of a problem with rivers, and a river is something where you'll see a series of spaces that will just sort of catch your eye, where they all sort of come up in a line. I don't really have a good example here. I find that those are often aided by using French spacing, which is a single space after a period, and by using a slightly higher leading. So I see fewer rivers in this 1.5 leading than I do in 1.2. And that's because the text is just further apart, that seeing this space between on and internship and this space between legal and status you don't wind up connecting those visually as much as you might if the leading were at 1.2. You might see that as a river. Another thing you can work on is you can mess with the justification a little bit by putting in a non-breaking space. So if I needed if I had a river earlier in this text, what I might do is say, please to put a non-breaking space between were and pulling, so that were and pulling were on the same line, and that would rework the justification of the text. That means that you would still have the justified edge here, the justified margin, but that it would pull all of the spaces over to the side. One thing you want to be careful of, obviously, is you don't want a line too sparse, and you don't want another line too full. But you can always mess with non-breaking spaces to sort of help out there. Okay. Fornius asks, do you always suggest using French spacing, or are there times when English spacing is more appropriate? So I don't. Actually, before I move off that subject, Fuzz says, when I see a river, it is by a weird artifact of copying from Word. So I do a find and replace for caret L, I believe, which is a line break, and replace with a paragraph. So, where you are typesetting, if you are going between formats, that may play a role as well. But onto French spacing versus English spacing. I am a ceaseless advocate for French spacing. In some programs, like I typeset this using LaTeX. It doesn't matter how many spaces I put between words. I told it to use French spacing. I find English spacing a lot more common in denser texts, usually nonfiction. So stuff like academic articles, stuff that is really explanation heavy, but isn't the sort of pop investigative journalism like Under the Banner of Heaven or stuff that Sarah Val writes. So if it's denser and there's a lot of meaning packed into each sentence, that is like explicit meaning rather than that is text rather than subtext. The fact that not too many here doesn't mean it doesn't mean a whole lot. That's more subtext than it is text. In those cases, you might want English spacing, which is 2 spaces after a period. Oh, yes. Yeah, Fuzz says, I didn't think 2 spaces after a period anywhere. That's like I said, like if you were writing academic articles, you might find it there. If you were writing your thesis, you might find it there. You're not going to find it in really any book, novel or anthology or fiction, and even most nonfiction that you find in a bookstore. Okay, so I guess one other thing I can show is I mentioned using multiple fonts. So let me go. Yeah, got my. So here's a case. I have one text for one character, or one font for one character, one font for the other. But those are the only 2 fonts I use, and there are also other differentiating factors. The fact that this is all indented by more than just the paragraph indent, the text indent. There's if you are going to do that, own it. This is another example of once you learn all of the rules of reducing all of those barriers, then you can work on breaking them. Like this book uses, it's got sheet music in it. Like the whole point of this book is to introduce difficulties in reading as part of the story itself. It's a technique called ergodic literature, where the act of reading it is part of the story itself. If you want to do that, cool, but keep in mind that that is something that you are going to probably is going to mean quite a bit to your reader, because if you want to trip them up, fine. If not, then you want to adopt a more minimalist approach to the approach to typesetting. I don't have too much else. I will drop the slides into Discord so that you all can access them. The reason that the slides weren't changing is that I've got the presentation layer here. It's got all of my, but if I was looking at this screen, then the slides weren't changing. So that's not supposed to happen, but it is what happened. So I will drop the link for these slides if you want to go through them. If you want to get all the notes, just hit P on your keyboard, and that'll open up the speaker console, and you can run through just using your arrow keys. Oops. If there are any other questions, I will be around on Twitch chat for a little while longer. I will be on Discord, and just feel free to hit me up at any time. I will know about typesetting until you tell me to shut up. So please feel free to approach me. This is something that I really truly love, and yeah, thank you all for tuning in. 2020 has been awful, so have courage and be kind. And I will see y'all later.